All right, next we have a panel on brackish groundwater, which I will be moderating. I'm going to wait for my panelists to come up to here on stage before I start with the introduction. So please join me on stage. All right, well, so this is the last panel of the conference, so we saved the best for last. Before we get started, I just want to take this opportunity to thank everybody for attending this year's summit. It has been a fantastic event. We so appreciate the support that all of you guys have given us. For those of you that have helped out, heartfelt thank you for your assistance. We could have absolutely not done it without that help. So as a staff of 3, we need all the help we can get, so we very much appreciate it. And I think the dates are going to be, for next year, going to be announced towards the end, but we do hope to see you guys here again next year. It'll be at the same location, so we really like it here and hope you guys do too. So with that, I am joined by 4 individuals to talk about brackish groundwater resources and their potential to offset or augment our freshwater supplies and needs here in Texas. So this past legislative session especially, but several sessions before that, there has been a big push to start tapping into those resources. And we're going to go over some of that legislation and kind of the timeline. But before we do that, I kind of want to first highlight what brackish is. So freshwater is anything under 1,000 TDS. And for those of you that don't know, TDS is total dissolved solids. It could be anything that's dissolved in the water. It's not, most people when they think of brackish water, they think of sodium and chloride, but it's really anything that's dissolved from in the water. Before I do that, I apologize. I think it's time to introduce my panel. So to my left, I have the Deputy Executive Administrator, and I'm not going to say the rest of it because it's so long.
It's too long. It's way too much. You get a pass. Go ahead, Adam.
I'll leave it as Deputy Executive Administrator at
I work for the Water Board. That's all you need to know.
Yeah. To his left, we have Isaac Sulemana, who is the Chief of Staff for the County Judge in Hidalgo County, and he will explain a little bit more about that and his efforts in Hidalgo County later. To his left, we have Mike Keister. He's the principal at KT Groundwater, works with a lot of districts. He's been involved in numerous brackish water projects, not just here in Texas, but in other locations as well. And then to his left, we have Sarah Kuba, who is the general manager of Lone Star Groundwater Conservation District. And so I've asked each of these individuals to join me on this panel and bring their unique perspective to this issue because they all have some interesting perspectives to share on this. So back to brackish groundwater. Traditionally, brackish groundwater has been defined from 1,000 to 10,000. Anything between 1,000 and 3,000 was considered slightly saline. Anything from 3,000 to 10,000 was considered moderate saline. And then above that, you get into the very saline and the brine, closer to seawater. And then you have hypersaline water, which is essentially any water that has TDS above 35,000 milligrams per liter. And there are several aquifers in Texas that have extremely high TDS values. So water can get saltier than seawater. Fresh water only makes up 1% of the water on Earth. So there is a lot of brackish and high TDS water out there. Traditionally, it's been very expensive to treat, and that's why we haven't necessarily done it. But as Texas grows, we've heard it over and over throughout this entire summit that we need to, conserve water, look for new water sources. So there is a lot of potential in brackish groundwater resources in Texas, but the issue is getting to it, managing it, and treating it. So we're gonna talk about some of those issues on this panel. So with that, I kind of want to talk about where we are right now as far as knowing how much is out there. The board has done a lot of good work on that in the past 7, 8 years, and really before that. So I'd first like John to kind of explain what y'all been doing with the BRACS program at the board.
Thank you, Adam. And first of all, good morning to everybody. And you guys are troopers. The last panel of the last day of the conference is usually pretty sparsely attended, so I really appreciate you being here. This means you're really into Brackish groundwater. So we'll try to make it worth your while. So just to provide a little bit of context in terms of the work that the board's done over the years, there's a bit of a history here. We've produced Brackish reports over the decades, but it really started in earnest in terms of estimating in-place volumes, distribution of those volumes with a contract study that the board contracted back in 2003. And the product of that study is shown here on the slide. The map on the left shows you the extent of it. But the point of this study was really to look at geographic distribution, especially how much brackish groundwater was around in place, and also ultimately the volumes, the overall estimated volumes in place. And I have to say it's pretty impressive. This study was done back in 2003, and we've refined it, obviously, and I'll go over where we're at now. But at that time, basically it concluded that brackish groundwater is ubiquitous. It's very widely distributed. It's in many parts of the state, which is what's mapped there. Also, there's a lot of it. We estimated about 2.7 billion acre feet of brackish groundwater. Again, this is that quality narrowly defined as total dissolved solids between 1,000 and 10,000 TDS. And this was the estimate at the time. And this, again, is an in-place volume, and I'll go more into the later in the talk into why that's significant relative to some of the availability estimates. But this was kind of the first shot at attempting to estimate the distribution of it and the total volume. And what we learned from this is that we should really invest some resources as an agency into providing a more refined characterization of this resource. And so the BRACS program is the program, and I've got some of my fine staff in the room today. They'll probably answer some of these questions or make some of these points better than I can, but I'm going to do the best, take a shot at it. But the BRACS program in earnest was appropriated by the legislature, started in 2009, with a specific purpose of following up on that initial estimate and providing a more focused assessment of the brackish portions of all the major and minor aquifers. And to date, we've made a lot of progress. The aquifers that are on the map, there's more than half of the major and minor aquifers. The work has been completed since 2009. And then when you add it all up, total volumes of in-place volumes is already at 3.3 billion acre feet of in-place brackish groundwater. Now that, again, that's between 1,000 and 10,000. These are in-place volumes, but already we're above that initial estimate from that original contract back in 2003. We still have a little more than half the state to do, so it's going to continue to grow. It's going to be a big number. This slide shows you sort of an overview of the last report, the BRACS study that we completed. This is for the Eastern Sparta system. This is kind of in the Gulf Coastal Plain, East Texas. It's to the east of the Colorado River, and it gives you just a general sense of how we do this work. There's a lot of complex analysis that goes behind this work. It's a lot of looking at thousands of geophysical logs, interpreting resistivity curves, converting those numbers to salinity numbers. And keep in mind, these are in parts of the aquifer where there's a real dearth of data. There are not a lot of samples that we can just collect and start to map those out. We really have to rely on geophysical logs and information that we collect from lots of different sources, principally oil and gas wells, and then very complex analysis, as I said, to convert those to salinity numbers, and then assumptions for aquifer properties to come up with these volumes. But this kind of gives you a high-level sense of what this looks like or what a study would look like. And so you see in the various colors there, the different colors represent a range of salinity. The blue is the fresh. The yellow is slightly saline, so that's 1,000 to 3,000, and then moderately saline is 3,000 to 10,000. And all total, the slightly saline and moderately saline added up to about 50 million acre feet of in-place water. I'm going to go ahead and put a caveat in here. I keep saying that in-place number needs a disclaimer. I'll go into more detail about that when we start talking about the zones. But it's comparable to the TERS discussion that happened earlier in the conference. That total storage number can be a bit misleading because it's a calculation of all the molecules in the aquifer. It's all of it. And we know that you physically cannot recover or produce every molecule of water. I gave the same analogy at the hearing earlier in July on some overview of groundwater stuff, but think about a sponge that's saturated with water, and then you wring out as much as you can. What's left is a wet sponge. There's still water that remains in the medium. That's the same with these aquifers. You can't physically remove it all. So that's just some important context in terms of what these in-place volumes are. Once you start to layer in different considerations to determine availability, it starts to scale back from then. But that's what we do with the zone designations, and I'll describe that more here later in a second.
Thank you for that, John. So, Mike, I'm going to turn to you. So, you're the practitioner. You're the one that's actually looking at this data for projects. So, what are some good sources of information, or where do you look to when you're developing these projects?
So, one of the first places that we're going to go to is actually just what John was talking about, that now that they've really been working, developing the BRACS program there at the Water Development Board has become a great resource to go look for some of this data. When we are trying to understand these aquifers and what we can develop, we're really wanting to understand what John was talking about a moment ago. We want to understand what that rock looks like, what's underground, what's the structure of the formations, are there faults, are there things that are compartmentalizing the water, what are those hydraulic properties, and of course then what's the water quality look like. Ideally, as we would love to have a water well down there, but depending upon where you are, that can be really expensive to get a well in there in order to sample it. In some cases, these GAMs do extend far enough down to where we know, well, we've done some work based on trying to figure out freshwater, what part of that structure looks like, what some of the properties may look like, so those will inform it. But just like John mentioned there and went into a little bit with the BRACS program, a lot of the work that we're doing is with geophysical logs and trying to understand the signatures on those logs, whether they be the electrical properties of the rock and the water in the formation, the radiation that's emitted by those formations, and then, if we're really lucky, some porosity logs down there. We'll use these tools and our interpretation of the data that's presented on those geophysical signatures to get a handle on what's underground.
Thanks, Mike. So we've kind of talked high level, statewide. Sarah, it's my understanding y'all have got some Brackish resources in Montgomery County. Can you talk a little bit about those and some of the efforts that your district has done to characterize those?
Sure. Well, I want to start by saying we don't have a designation of brackish groundwater, so I don't want to make sure there's no misconception there. But we do have the Catahoula, and we have the potential for groundwater projects moving forward, or maybe the redesignation of our brackish groundwater zone, depending on what the Water Development Board has to do or whatever pressure ends up being put on their teams. But we do encourage the drilling in the Catahoula, and we also know that that's a way of the future, especially where we have strong spacing restrictions in our county, that they're going to have to drill deeper without more additional alternative water resources available. So we charge less. The water rate is cheaper the deeper that you go. So if you drill into the Catahoula, that's an incentive. And we also have a less restrictive spacing requirement to try to make it easier for you or incentivize it, because it is so much more expensive. So that's been a starter for us. It hasn't been incredibly successful yet. I mean, we have 14 Catahoula wells in our entire county, and we have a pretty big county as far as growth is concerned. But we expect to see that grow, but it is considered freshwater wells at this time because it's under 1,000 TDS, but there has been reporting of an increase in that salinity, so we haven't been able to pinpoint that just yet, but we expect to see more of those applications come in the future, and we're really going to have to lean on the Water Development Board and follow what they do on any kind of redesignation, depending on that elimination checklist, and if any of that changes, or the halos around injection wells, or whatever legislation,
yeah,
whatever strong one blows.
And we're going to get into like the managing bit a little later, but especially the brackish groundwater production zones, because I definitely want to make sure that everybody knows the difference between those and just areas outside that, and the difference in the permitting structure. But we'll get to that. So Isaac, as some people in this room may know, y'all have got a lot of issues down in the valley regarding water supply. And the reason we wanted you to come here and talk to our audience was kind of share some of your perspectives and give them an idea of what it's like actually trying to deal with that going forward, because you've kind of been pushed to a spot where others are going to be pushed. You're already there. So can you kind of explain what's been happening down in the valley as far as water resources and some of the efforts that y'all have been looking into?
Absolutely, and thank you for including me. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to start with a little bit of a confession, and that's that part of this is a reconnaissance mission on behalf of the people of the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas, because as Adam alluded to, we have almost been completely dependent on surface water. We depend on the Amistad and Falcon reservoirs, and that has been our way of life for as long as I can remember. And so here recently, with some of the international issues, a decrease in rainfall and the inflows from both the Mexican and American tributaries, we had to face the reality that we needed to start exploring other sources of water. Most of the water that is under Hidalgo County and the Rio Grande Valley is going to be brackish by definition. We have one district in Hidalgo County. Surprisingly, it wasn't actually created for water management purposes, but more as a response to some illegal landfills and some concerns that the landowners had at that time. But now it's proving to be a very valuable resource. And so as we begin to try to develop that brackish resource, we have to decide as a community, as local government, what it is that we expect, how we're going to approach it, and how we make that transition from what has really been an I don't want to say unmanaged, but something that every landowner has felt complete autonomy in how they approach their use in their area, and even our regional water supply corporations have felt autonomy in how they approach their individual needs, how we can bring that into more of a regional, countywide, and multi-county plan to make sure that we take advantage of all the resources, including the funding and the science behind brackish water.
Thank you for that. So we've talked about, kind of estimates on what's out there. I kind of want to get into the permitting aspect, from a state level and all the way down to the GCD. So one of the things that you had already alluded to earlier was these brackish groundwater production zones. So Sarah, do you mind just kind of telling the audience what those are and kind of distinguish those between what's in the zone and what's outside of the zone?
Sure. Feels strange giving any specifics on this sitting next to John Dubnik and Mike Keister, and I don't know Isaac as well. But anyway, I'll give it my best shot and hot potato it if I can't answer it well. But I would say basically you're looking at two different categories. So you've got brackish, which is more a physical, which Adam, you've described was 1,000 TDS through 10,000 TDS, and then you've got the brackish zone, which is more regulatory. As mentioned, brackish is nearly everywhere, but may not fit into the exceptions that are designated by the Water Development Board. So I did write that down for myself so I don't mess it up. But we've got, must be an area that has more than 1,000 TDS. That's not serving as a significant source of water supply for municipal, domestic, or agricultural use. Or that's hydrogeologically separated from areas in the aquifer with TDS of 1,000 mg or less. It must be, let's see here. Okay, so you've got the historically used 15-mile halo around the wastewater injection wells. And I'm told there's not a rule, a TWDB rule on that 15-mile halo, so that may change in the future. That's something that we're keeping an eye on. And also, there's some carve-out, so it can't be in the Edwards Aquifer Authority, Barton Springs, Edwards Aquifer Conservation District, can't be in the Subsidence District, Harris, Galveston, or Fort Bend. I think that covers the rules. And then, how much you can pump without too much impact on the fresh groundwater is evaluated, which that all comes down the pipeline from the water.
That was a perfect representation. John, can you kind of go through that actual designation? Like, what do y'all do at the board looking at those zones? Because I know the legislature has kind of mandated y'all to do that. So can you talk more about the technical aspects of that?
Yeah, I certainly can. And Sarah, I can add a little bit onto what you described there. But the slide in front of you kind of describes the entire process in terms of how we go from in-volume estimates to or ultimately designating the brackish groundwater production zones. But I wanted to back up and provide a little bit of additional context in terms of how we got there and how this process evolved over time. Before I had this hat on, I was representing a groundwater district, and in 2015, the Chairman Lyle Larson at the time was really interested in providing ways or providing a mechanism that could really incentivize more brackish groundwater development. And the perception, no offense to everybody in this room, was that but for districts, there will be more projects. And that was just a way of saying that there was a want for regulatory certainty, there was a want for uniformity among regulation of brackish groundwater. So we went through a long process. When I say we, I was part of the TWCA legislative committee at the time of really thinking about what that looked like. And so where the chairman had landed was that to address the concerns of brackish groundwater being connected to update freshwater and being linked up to other sources, he asked the question, what if you could just find those pockets in the state that were relatively isolated and had long-term production potential with minimum risk of impacting all these things that all the stakeholders were concerned about? That's how the concept of a zone initially started. And sure enough, 2015, HB 30 was passed. That's what charged our board with designating the zones, and all these criteria were layered in there to find those pockets, those sweet spots that we call them. That process was always intended to have a permitting component to it, kind of a step two. First designate the zone, then create a regulatory structure within the zones. But HB 30 was a lot to tackle at first, so that was the first iteration. Then 2019 is when the regulatory piece came in. But this process on the slide kind of describes generally how we go through designating the zones. We start with identifying the areas. We're really looking where needs are and strategies are in the state, namely from the state water plan. We do the analysis that Mike was talking about, really looking at some of these resistivity curves, the geophysical data, to come up with these estimates of salinity. Then we perform the volumetric calculations. Then ultimately we designate, we use that information to designate the zones. And what I describe the zones to really just be is, I call them the sweet spots. And it's all those things I just described. If you're really looking for those parts of the state that have the highest potential for long-term production capacity, 30 to 50 years is the way it's described, and it's got moderate to high production capacity, and it's also separated from freshwater sources, meaning that there's distance from up-dip freshwater, and then there's vertical separation between overlying aquifers. Then you start to carve out the districts that are excluded from this process. So it's parts of the High Plains, Barton Springs, Edwards Aquifer, the subsidence districts. And then when you start to carve out existing wells and you buffer those, agricultural municipal wells, then you start to carve out the injection well areas. You really do narrow it down to a very narrow set of area that would fit all these criteria. So the zones on the map there are described. There are 31 zones that have been designated to date. And all total, when you add up the availability, the annual capacity, it equals to about 120,000 acre feet per year. So I get this question all the time. How do you go from 3.3 billion acre feet in place to 120,000 acre feet of potential production? It is the product of all these criteria. I kind of think about it in terms of like total storage, TERS numbers. This was a conversation earlier in the conference versus the product of a MAG or of a DFC. I think there are a lot of parallels there. The statute has basically defied the criteria that we use to come up with a DFC, which represents these zones. And then when we calculate the volumes that are left for these areas, that's like a MAG. And they're starting to get closer and closer in terms of how those two comparisons link up. But that's effectively what this is. So this is that's how the zones are created. And again, 31 to date. Northern Trinity is the winner that was the last one done. We've got 15 zones designated up there.
Thank you, John. And just so everybody aware, a lot of the legislation this past session was specifically targeted to these brackish groundwater production zones. To my knowledge, there wasn't any legislation that directly dealt with other brackish other than SB 7, which basically defined 3,000 milligrams per liter as water that could be, or anything above 3,000 milligrams per liter could be funded with those new funds, and the new or the money itself, and including in the new water, what is it, Newt? The Newt. So obviously there's a different permitting structure in each one, and John, can you briefly talk about what the permitting structure is inside those zones, and then I'm going to ask Sarah to kind of follow up what permitting is like outside of those zones.
Yeah, of course. So I was describing the evolution of this process. The zone piece was always intended to go with the permitting piece. The zones came with to us in HB 30. Then 2019, HB 722 created the permitting structure. So I'll try to describe a very high level version of that. But in essence, the goal is to provide regulatory certainty, provide uniformity among districts in terms of how they regulate brackish projects in a brackish zone. But at a high level, the way it works is that districts are required to adopt rules. Well, they can adopt rules on their own that effectively follow the statute as it's prescribed. If they haven't adopted rules, there's a petition process to initiate that rule adoption. Once the rules are in place, the applicant can submit the application per the information requirements of the statute. It's another thing the statute's very clear on. It prescribes all the information, including the technical information. And the reason it's so specific about the technical piece, because this permitting process is unique in that the technical review will be performed by the Water Development Board. So all that information submitted to the districts for an application, the technical information comes to the board. We take a look at it. We look at certain things. We look at compatibility within the zone volumes. We look at potential for any significant impacts. And we also recommend monitoring requirements. Provide that report to the district. The district makes their permitting decision. If the permit's issued, then there's also a requirement of the applicant to provide an annual report to actually measure and monitor conditions once the project starts up. And then there's another process by which the district can request technical review of the board to look at if something's different or unanticipated. They can ask us to look at that. We can, measure whether there was some significant impact or not, and then that will open them up to make an amendment to the permit if there's something that was unanticipated. But all that's prescribed by the statute in terms of how the districts permit.
And has anyone ever applied for one?
That would be a big old no. So I say that to say this: we don't know how it's going to work in practice, and I will say it's a little unique. I'll call it that we're in the role of providing permit review of a district permit application, but we don't know how it's going to work because, to your point, Adam, it has not happened yet.
So you got everything in place, just raring to go. Okay, thank you. Sarah, so can you talk about permitting outside and some of the things that your district have put in your rules regarding brackish groundwater resources, or trying to, and you alluded to this a little bit earlier about trying to incentivize brackish groundwater production?
Well, again, it's for us, we're saying it more, we're incentivizing going deeper because we're not a brackish groundwater zone, which we would clearly lean very heavily on the Water Development Board to help us walk through that process should we get designated a zone. So we would be holding hands together trying to figure that out, I think, in that process. But, I mean, we have a placeholder for brackish groundwater rules to be developed in the event that a zone is created or our rules are petitioned for us to issue a groundwater permit for brackish. From what I know about Chapter 36 and the 1015 and all that is we would have to expedite it, which kind of elevates the issue of it being a first-time learning process, and you have to expedite it. But I think currently with what we've got permitted in the ground or in the Catahoula is no different than the shallower aquifers. Is you have to have the rights to the groundwater and, to produce the groundwater. So that's no different than a freshwater depth. Again, we haven't had anyone apply for a Catahoula well since 2018. So they're not moving toward it currently, but we do push the lower rates, and spacing is likely going to be what drives people deeper for us, at least now. We've got issues with accessing alternative water supplies. We're growing very fast, so a lot of these public water suppliers are running into issues with their infrastructure and artesian pressure, and so their options are pretty limited, and they're going to end up going deeper. And then if you have spacing restrictions, you have to go even deeper than that and figure out yourself how you want to invest and what's going to be the best move for you and your constituents moving forward. And so those are some of the challenges that we're facing, and the expectation is until there's more alternative water resource availability and whatever that's going to look like, they're gonna start having to go deeper. And we've got Chico Evangeline, and then we've got the Jasper, which the radius is. The deeper you go, it's kind of the benefit in our district to try to encourage you to stay away from the shallower drilling. Right now it's easier to drill, or as far as the spacing restrictions and radius are, it's easier for you to drill into the Jasper, and it's that much easier to drill into the Catahoula. So that's really the extent of us encouraging it as of now, because it's expensive.
You mentioned earlier there's a price difference in the production fee. Can you touch a little bit on that and maybe the process that you went through and changed?
Sure. It's 8.5 cents per 1,000 gallons. It's 6 cents per 1,000 gallons to drill into the Catahoula and to use that. And we are a demand-based district, so you're going to pay that allocation fee in advance, whether you use a gallon of it or the extent of your allocation, and you pay it annually. So it's a cheaper version for you to try to offset some of the expenditures for having to drill that deep. And whether you may not be at 1,000 on TDS to hit a Brackish, to be considered Brackish, but you're still going to have to do some expensive. You get pretty close to that. It's not that much different to have to, whatever expenses that's going to take to make it potable water.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. So Isaac, you're in an area where there's a couple of GCDs. There's Red Sands that's in Hidalgo, but it's not in all of Hidalgo County. So the projects, my understanding is the projects you've been working on, or the county's been working on, hasn't had any oversight or any management because it lacks a district. Who have y'all been working with? What state agencies have y'all been working on permitting these and getting the data that you need for these projects?
So in Hidalgo County, the county itself really has limited authority. We're more in the position of trying to provide leadership, because we have what we consider essentially 5 regional suppliers that are larger, either rural water supply corporations and some of our municipalities, but we also have 14 smaller utilities. And as we started to face the need for additional sourcing, every one of them, strict rule of capture, everyone individually started to go out and seek their own funding. I know a lot of them are working with the Water Development Board, seeking for additional funding. There's test wells. I don't want to give an exact number, but it feels like every single one of those utilities is currently seeking to pursue a test well. Some of them are already in production, but when our county usage is at about, I'm going to say maybe 150 to 200 MGD, depending on who you ask. The groundwater production of that is single digits. And so we are in the infancy of trying to figure out what the consequences, if any, will be from that development. So even the brine, the discharge, it's still a relatively minor problem in our issue that we can see will grow into something that requires a lot of attention. So aside from the Water Development Board and TCEQ that we have to work with on the normal processes, we're looking to, a good example would be the North American Development Bank that's coming in to help us try to regionalize our approach and see if we can start to develop the parameters of what essentially might be a district before we're able to pursue adoption of a countywide district.
Thank you for that. So we've kind of given you a broad overview now. I'd like to talk about some of the challenges in actually producing from brackish groundwater zones. So, Sarah, we talked in the planning sessions about some of the concerns that you had once these projects actually go online, as far as meeting DFCs, how they're going to be impacting that. Can you speak a little bit to that? What concerns y'all have?
Well, again, it's kind of thinking forward on what we could be facing should there be a designation of a brackish zone in our district. But it's kind of the monitoring, I think, has a lot I would be concerned about is after these kinds of investments go in to try to curtail. Well, I mean, there's so many aspects to it, but to try to have a monitoring system which I believe the Water Development Board, you kind of give us the guidance on how we're supposed to monitor that and the requirements. But I know Chapter 36 is kind of silent on whether or not the permittee pays for a lot of that monitoring, or if the district is supposed to cover the expenses on a lot of that monitoring. So those would be kind of the first questions that I would have. And also, at what point would you stop? How do you tell them when you have to do a curtailment? Or let's just say we're looking at south of the Woodlands, there's suddenly 100 feet worth of artesian pressure loss. That can create a huge impact very fast on what we already have, issues we're facing with that being a higher groundwater pumping area. We're bordered with Harris County right there. We have our own set of problems now. If you take a large groundwater brackish project, and the assumption is they will be large projects if you're going to invest to go that deep, and to try to stop it at that point, I'm not even sure where we would begin with that. So,
Are those volumes in the Catahoula, are those in your MAG?
they are not included in the MAG. And so that may be something, we're in joint planning right now in our GMA, so that may be something we want to consider looking at. And I defer to those that were before me as to why it was excluded. I assume it's because you don't want to overinflate the MAG with water that you can't actually get your hands on, kind of like John was talking about. Sometimes, acknowledging the storage is a good thing to, it's got to start somewhere. You have to know exactly what you've got, which I think was mentioned in a different presentation, but at the same time, that can be misleading. And so I think that was likely the reason why it was excluded from the MAG. But I mean, we still include it in our pumping numbers. So whenever we make that public information on where we'll say it in our charts, this is the Catahoula, but the public sees it and they say, oh, your MAG is this amount and you're using this amount. We include that because we still think it's important, especially if it's water that's being used. But it is something we'll have to look at in this planning cycle, and whether or not it's the best move forward to include it in the MAG or not. I don't fully have the answer for that because I think it's got its pros and cons.
Well, that kind of leads me to my next question to John. Why are they not included in the MAG? What is it about the models that they're not able to include those values?
Well, I can only go off the context of the discussions at the time. And when you have gray hair like this, that you've got history and context, and sometimes that's the only value you have. But I can recall when that discussion was happening early on, when HB 30 was just in its infancy, everybody was very careful to be cognizant of districts that were already regulating brackish groundwater. They are also very sensitive to the concern that creating a path to a permit or sort of a separate type of water that was less limited, less restricted, or defined, prescribed by statute in terms of how it was managed, that there had to be some guardrails in there to prevent it from impacting some of the other offers and how they were managed. So that language that is added to the statute, that the volumes determined in the zones would be in addition to the MAGs. I think it was try to create some separation between these MAG volumes and parts of other offers that were already under a DFC and already had a calculated MAG and were already being permitted per that structure.
Yeah. What TDS values do most of the models go to? I mean, I know there's some that go up to like 5,000, but like on average, or for what's the norm for most of the models?
Yeah, so for the Edwards, they're going to be about 1,000, but let's put those over here. Most of the model extents carry over into about 3,000 TDS. So that's where you're going to have some overlap. If we're calculating volumes for that slightly saline portion between 1,000 and 3,000, that's going to overlap with the existing models. And then outside of that, 3,000 to 10,000, I think we do have one aquifer. I want to say the DOCM, the extent of the GAM goes to about 5,000 TDS, if I recall. But there is going to be certainly that overlap between 1,000 and 3,000, at least within the GAMs.
Okay, thank you. And Mike, from the technical perspective, is there a difference when modeling freshwater versus brackish water? What are those considerations? Do you have to use different models, different packages? Can you kind of speak to a little bit to that? Just a high level. We don't want to get too technical, but just a high level overview.
Yeah, certainly I know some of the other modelers in here, we can get really technical talking about that, but the GAMs are kind of, they do give us a starting point, and we can always look at extending those down into the deeper portions or more saline portions, or even in like Isaac's area where where brackish is really shallow. Some of them already cover that. But when we start wanting to look at the changes in water quality that can occur within these models, we do have, we can bring in some of the different packages, as you mentioned with ModFlow 6, that was discussed quite a bit during the GAMS discussion the other day, and some of its abilities. We can bring in those transport models to understand how water quality may change or may be drawn in from different parts of these formations into an area where brackish production is occurring. Even as a step prior to that, though, we can just look at how we parameterize the models with the transmissivity, since it is really driven by both the rock and the fluid properties. We can take some careful considerations even on the front end of getting a more qualitative look at it by just getting our parameterization a little more, consider some of the, how that can change in the subsurface.
Yeah, I definitely think that we're gonna have to take a closer look at the statewide models and the mags, and you know, as we start permitting more and more of these projects, we're going to have to maybe refine the models and add additional modeling layers to really be able to include those into the assessments. So now I want to talk about, you got your permits, you got everything set. What are some considerations when you're actually starting one of these projects? As far as drilling the well, siting the well, spacing, you know, considerations. Can you kind of speak a little bit to that?
Sure, it's a long list, so we'll try and go through that pretty quick here, but when we're starting to consider actually trying to physically put in that well and find out what's in the subsurface, it is, of course, going to be site-specific. Some areas, as I mentioned with Isaac, you know, you've got relatively shallow. It's a little bit easier to drill those wells. Or we have areas, we recently did a test well for Aqua Water Supply Corporation in Caldwell County, where that one we had to drill it to about 3,500 feet. So it was more of a challenge in the Trinity there. So some things that we want to look at is, you know, what kind of pressures and temperatures might we be dealing with? What kind of salinity do we expect when we're getting down there? Because bringing that water up to the surface could be a problem with trying to handle saline water, especially when you just kind of have a bracket of what that salinity may be. We'll want to consider what type of methods we want to drill, what type of drilling fluids in order to, if we do have high pressures that we have to deal with, we want to be able to keep those fluids in place, so get our drilling fluids right. For some of these wells, there's only going to be a few drillers out there that are really capable of drilling them, so another consideration. And then how do we want to test it? As I mentioned, sometimes you don't want to get this water all onto the surface, whereas with a traditional pumping test, we could complete a well, discharge it onto the surface, let it flow. If we're dealing with some salty water, that becomes a real challenge and can be a very costly challenge to deal with. So I was talking with Daniel Lupton the other day in Terra, and he was talking about some different testing that they don't actually have to pump any of the water. On the Aqua WSC well we did, we were actually able to, we didn't even have to complete a well in order to sample the water quality. We worked with Schlumberger, and they were able to put a tool down there, capture water quality by basically pumping, stealing against the borehole wall, getting that mud out of there, and capturing formation water so that we could sample without actually having to complete a well. So that created certainly some savings as well. So all of these different things you would need to, how you're going to test, how you're going to sample, do you really want to go forward with completing a well? These are different considerations that are that you will want to deal with.
And obviously, if there's any overlying freshwater, there's all sorts of standards, state and local. Got to get permitted through TCEQ. So it's a lot of additional regulation and construction considerations.
Right. Those one of the bullets I skipped over is how many casing strings do you want to put in the well in order to make sure you're protecting those freshwater sources?
Okay. So I know a big consideration is also impacts to freshwater. So both in BGPCs and outside of BGPCs. So John, can you talk to a little bit about some of the considerations or things that you think about when you need to monitor for these? Like what additional monitoring steps, programs do you need to have in place once these projects actually go online to protect freshwater sources?
Yeah, it's just like anything. You know, you can do as much as you can when there's very limited data with paper studies, with modeling exercises. You have to make certain assumptions in a lot of cases. You have to pull in the best available information that might not be representative of that specific aquifer or that specific site or that specific project. But all of these exercises have to be backed up with some sort of monitoring to see, in fact, did you get the modeling right? Were the assumptions right? You really don't know until you start producing. So one of our roles in this process is that we will recommend when we're designating the zones a monitoring program, but that's kind of general. It's typically the up dip, down dip sort of monitor well configuration that would be associated with a project. What that would look like in a particular permit application review, because that's also a role of ours, we will look at the generalized recommendations for monitoring we provide in terms of the zone designation, and then when we go through this review, which hadn't happened yet, we would look more specifically at the project. A lot of the technical information that will be provided with the permit application will include modeling files, any data that they may have, and then we would recommend a customized monitoring program to really measure for those things. We would look at where are the sources that could be impacted of interest. Are they up dip? Are they up vertically? You know, what are we trying to monitor to measure or to mitigate for in terms of significant impacts? And then we would, you know, recommend a monitoring system accordingly. Again, we've not done this, and so we would just have to work through it and figure it out.
Okay, great. Now I'd kind of like to move on to some of the current projects, what's out there right now on the state level. John, can you kind of talk about what we've already seen and maybe where we're going to see them going forward?
Yeah, so I'm going to cheat here. This is a report that we provide to the legislature every biennium. It's our report on desalination activity. So it's all baked into this report, and we provide an update on some of the current capacity out that's already in the state. And that's what this map and this plot is reflecting. And all the red boxes are the Brackish groundwater projects. And you see the concentration of them are really the big ones we know about. The K. Bailey Hutchinson plant out in El Paso, that was one of the first ones. The Saws H2 Oaks project, that's of course in the San Antonio area. I don't at all talk about their production capacity because they're similar and they've got a little friendly competition going on in terms of who's got the biggest one, biggest inland desal plant. They're both scaled to be big. There's also concentration in the valley, some projects down there. And then the plot on the right shows you how that capacity has kind of increased over time. There are some surface water desal projects. There are no seawater. Obviously, Corpus has been trying to get going for some time, but that reflects the capacity of desalination over time, most of it being brackish groundwater. And this plot shows you a map of all the projects in the current state water plan. And the yellow little dots are the proposed brackish groundwater projects. So a lot of interest in the I-35 corridor, particularly around Central Texas, and then of course in Isaac's area down in the valley, a few out in El Paso up in North Texas. But all total, it's a relatively low volume. You add up all these projects, they're only about 2% of all the new water supply strategies in the state water plan. So there's certainly, I think there's potential, I think there's interest. But as many have said, these are expensive projects, and it takes a lot just to do the field testing. part of what we do in the BRACS program is we try to do as much of the upfront feasibility, data collection to give you a sense of what to expect, but the investment really comes in piloting, putting in test wells, doing the aquifer testing, doing the projects. But so that might explain why there's relatively few now.
Yeah, well,
But
I expect we're going to see a lot
I expect
more.
the interest will grow.
With the funding coming, I think we're going to see an explosion of these projects from around the state. Isaac, so obviously there's a lot of yellow dots down there in Hidalgo County. Can you talk to a couple of those and kind of share with our audience some of the experience that y'all have had with those projects, getting them online? Anything that they should be made aware of? Anybody potentially looking into these projects?
No, and as I was looking at the map, I realized maybe I hadn't put it into context, but that four-county area down at the very southern tip of Texas, we call it the Rio Grande Valley, Starr, Hidalgo, Willacy, and Cameron. And Starr County is in the process of reorganizing their district. Hidalgo County has a small one as far as the Red Sands district, and then, to my knowledge, none of those projects are inside any kind of district. So we have a situation where Hidalgo County, the central portion of that, has a population of roughly a little over 1 million people, which makes us the 7th most populous county in the state. And that a previous slide showed that there is an anticipated yearly production of about 120,000 acre feet. But the current deficit that we're facing in our surface water over the last 4 years is 1 million acre feet of water that hasn't arrived that we were expecting. So that's why you see that concentration and that urgency. Most of those dots will probably represent the North Alamo Water Supply Corporation, Iowa Special Utility District, Sharyline Water Supply Corporation, and maybe one or two of our larger municipalities that are all in the process of developing some groundwater production.
And what type of plants are they?
Those are going to be RO plants. They're all, I think, I don't want to speak for them personally, right on that county line for ag use. We drilled a well, went down a couple hundred feet, and we had, I think, 7,500 TDS. So all that there is going to be, it's all RO. I don't know what their planned production is. If I am not mistaken, they're going to be in the 2 to 4 range per cluster or per entity, but most of these are still in the development phase. To my knowledge, only 2 or 3 have actually been completed, and they're still very preliminary as far as blending their water into the surface water availability because of cost factors.
Okay. All right. Well, we are almost out of time, unfortunately. I think we did a good overview of what's going on in the state regards brackish groundwater. Some of the, the numbers involved as far as like total volumes, a little bit of the management issues, considerations, permitting, monitoring. So if there's anything that y'all would like to leave with the audience before we let you guys go, could you take like a minute or two to just summarize? And I guess, Sarah, we'll start with you.
Of course, you would start with me. What did Mr. Brian McMath say yesterday? Stump the chump. I mean, we're going to have to look at alternative water resources. I get that that's why an angle in the legislature, and that's why, their intentions are really good. I think we have to be careful with anything that we make in a rash or fast decision when it comes to legislation. And we've got to lean on all of the experts. No, I'm not calling myself one, everyone else on this panel, and make sure that, we're going to keep growing. Texas is going to keep growing. We have a lot of different obstacles depending on where you are. We don't have systematic rules, even if, in a general sense, if we could, across the GMA, make spacing restrictions or hydrogeologic requirements more consistent, and then keep our permitting more localized. That might give us a better land space as we figure out how to move forward with the growing population, especially hearing some of the previous speakers from different states that, we don't really operate the same way where we stop that development, and we're going to continue to move forward. And in my particular aquifer, we don't have GACs, and Commissioners Court's already approved land development and plating, and the engineering's done by the time an application hits our desk. So we just have different playing fields. And so I think we have to look at, you know, even if we exhaust our surface water and we're working towards a new water and all of this, brackish groundwater is going to be a next step. I think, or, you know, desal in some areas, and we've got to just start preparing for that. That's a way of the future, and in areas where we do have strong spacing, it's going to be sooner rather than later that they go deeper, and we'll have to figure this thing out. And so, you know, we'll just keep tapping into the Water Development Board and then lean on our neighbors who maybe try it before us. Try not to reinvent the wheel each time, but learn from each other. Maybe find a way to complement each other better in our joint planning. I think would be a great way to move forward.
Thanks, Sarah. Mike?
So I would say that, you know, one of the things that we think of when we're developing these brackish resources or saline resources that we always try to, as hydrogeologists, work with a great team. You know, it takes some really good engineers to deal with the treatment once we get this water out of the ground. And then there's also going to always be the question of when you're looking at these projects, what do you do with, as Isaac mentioned, you know, that you got to deal with do something with the wastewater that comes from the treatment process. Mm-hmm. So whether that continues to be another formation that you can inject it back into, or find a way to blend it in with some other water, but it takes a really good team working with a lot of individuals, a lot of experts to really develop these resources.
Thanks, Mike. Isaac?
And, you know, while Hidalgo County and the Rio Grande Valley doesn't usually identify as one of the big metro areas, I think it's clear that the challenges that we're facing across the state are fairly similar. We have a very large population, but it's highly concentrated, and as that urbanization starts to spill over into more and more of our formerly rural areas, these challenges become very, very real. And kind of what Sarah said, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. These challenges have been faced by somebody else, some of our neighbors, other people in the state, and it's going to be critical that we work together, because the development of brackish groundwater and just water in general really is a statewide issue where we are going to have to work collaboratively.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, wow, final word of the conference. A lot of pressure. Holy cow.
We've got one more speaker.
I'll just say that if anything, the work that we've done has confirmed there's a lot of brackish groundwater out there. I would just caution everybody to not think of this as a separate bucket of water that's independent of all the other sources. These are connected systems. They're linked up with the other resources. You can't go into it and develop it as if it's an independent bucket of water that's, you know, outside of the other sources. It just reinforces that it's going to require integrated planning. It's going to require coordination. It's going to require careful development of these projects to really make sure that we take advantage of the development potential of those future resources, but we do it intentionally and we're smart about how we develop those projects.
Absolutely. All right, well, we are out of time, and please join me in giving my four panelists a round of applause.